Good morning, welcome back to my channel. It's Emma. Let's talk about the books I read in November. I'm gonna start with my favorite and I think I'm just gonna move through them chronologically because we have a lot to talk about, so let's get started. I actually had two 5-star reads this month, but my favorites, of course, above all, this was actually a buddy read with Lucy from Crescent Pages. I'll leave her beautiful, wonderful channel and her beautiful, wonderful face down below. And this was actually also a gift from Lucy for my birthday back in July. I gave it 5 stars. It like changed me during the time that I was reading it, and that is The Dark Interval by Rilke. The Dark Interval, this isn't I guess technically a body of his work. This is a collection of his letters on loss, grief, and transformation. These are letters that he wrote to his friends, to his family, and to sometimes, as often Rilke does, to complete strangers who write to him. In this case, these letters are all themed around the topic of death and loss and grief and the side of life that he so beautifully says is turned away from us. We all know Rilke is my favorite everything, but this was just actually extremely helpful, extremely nourishing, and it's the kinds of creation, this collection of letters edited by Ulrich Baer, but it's that kind of thing that when all these letters are put together and you read them, it's this experience that can't help but leave you transformed and at least alter your train of thought and your thinking and your perception of life and death, because for Rilke, death is not something to fear. It is not something to push away. It is something to hug, because for Rilke, death is this animal that we all kind of shun and scream at and don't understand and don't give any energy over to understanding or to loving. And even though it is completely ingrained in us that death is this terrifying, tragic, horrible beast, Rilke really, really encourages those who have experienced this horrible beast to love it and to think of it as the completion of death, as this full circle to be celebrated and to be loved, and any pain or grief or anguish we experience from that death only enriches our lives and is only a cause to push us deeper into life. This was just an incredibly, immeasurably powerful experience. It always is reading Rilke's work, but this one in particular, to have so much focus driven in on one topic, on one point, and so much of Rilke's work is about suffering and happiness and life and death and that balance and reconciling the two and putting them back together, since they have been torn apart by us, by humans, by people, in our grief and in our misunderstanding, and to really have these ideas put down for you in one place. So powerful, so eye-opening, but also so hard to take into yourself and to believe and to really, really experience that way of thinking. So I always turn a page, read a sentence, and it feels like Rilke is just like literally right there writing something that maybe you could have written yourself. I absolutely loved it. 5 stars. I'm so glad I had Lucy along with me on this journey. Thank you again, you beautiful, wonderful person. I love you. And I'm so happy to finally have another one of my Rilke books done, read, and I loved it so much. All right, so going chronologically from there, the first book I read in November, to be honest, November for me was just like spooky season 2, Electric Boogaloo. But the first book I read is one that I've honestly kind of just forgotten. It's a book that I'm never gonna think of again. It's not one that I want to take with me into the rest of my present moments, if that makes sense. It doesn't occupy any space in my mind, unfortunately, and that is Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. This is the first in the series of Wayward Children, I believe, and I have to say the concept for this series and for this book was really interesting. So in this world, there are portals and there are doors and places to walk through that will take you into a fantasy land. And for our protagonist, Nancy, who fell into this door that led her into the halls of the dead and the world of the dead, that is the fantasy land that she has been living in. And so when she is popped back out into the real world, her life is just immense pain. And so when many of these children can't adjust to life back with the rest of us, they are sent to this school for wayward children. However, most of these young adults are planning and structuring their days around trying to get back to their respective fantasy worlds. At the school, we follow a whole bunch of people who have come from varying different kinds of lands and fantasy landscapes, and so when a murder rocks the school, we kind of are entered into this mystery where Nancy and her friends have to solve what keeps happening to her fellow classmates. They keep going missing, they keep dying. It's quite gruesome, quite gory, quite graphic, and that's kind of all it was, honestly. Like, I gave it 3 stars. I liked the writing. I want to say the portrayal of the characters was very realistic. They felt like quite real people with real emotions, which a lot of the time is my biggest complaint with young adult. It doesn't feel like a real person, a real young person. It's so short. I think it's actually a novella technically. There really wasn't a huge exploration of anything going on. I didn't feel attached to the characters. I didn't have any time to feel attached to them. And I just wasn't really thrilled with the way that this premise was carried out. It just felt like the weirdest thing ever. One thing I did like about it was that the grief that these people are experiencing coming back from their escapist realities is very much the grief that one feels after closing the last page of a book, after finishing a series or a movie or any fantastical thing that wasn't reality that is now finished to you, that you know the ending of, and you're spat back out into the real world and you have to deal with this loss of something that was providing you joy and comfort and distraction from the pain of reality. Wow. Overall, I thought it had some really beautiful lines. The writing was all right, and the premise was really interesting. Just didn't love the way that it was carried out. Okay, and then we have a young adult book that I really loved. And this one is very, very strange because this young adult series is literally just like copy and paste pretty much every other trope and storyline and structure of every other young adult fantasy novel out there. But in this case, I didn't mind at all. I think because at the time it was exactly what I wanted. I loved the characters. I thought the writing was actually quite beautiful and really made this similar plot to everything I've already ever read in my life good and fresh, and I really felt like I loved the characters so much, and that is Frostblood by Ellie Blake. So as you might imagine, Frostblood is kind of like an elemental fantasy world where we have Frostbloods and Firebloods who can of course respectively work frost and fire. In this world, a lot is going on. The kingdom is currently run by a Frostblood evil king who's not doing a good job. He's basically just driving his people and the people of the Firebloods into the ground. He's not really doing anyone any favors, and in this world we are following our protagonist Ruby, who is a Fireblood. She lives with her mother in the snowy mountains trying to hide her gift, otherwise she will be taken, imprisoned, and probably sent to fight to the death in the king's arena, where he pits his Frostbloods against Fireblood traitors. So one day when Ruby practices her gift too much and soldiers from the keep come kill her mother and take her away, she is set on this journey and this quest and thrust into this world that she didn't really want to be a part of, which, yes, how many books can we describe that way? What saved this one for me, and what saved this one for Ruby, is that she is rescued from the keep and she is taken to a monastery where she is meant to train with Firebloods who are trying to regain their kingdom and their country's health. Primarily, she trains with two really great characters. Brother Thistle, who is this wonderful, old, loving, really funny, really kind of spiteful, spunky monk. He is a spunky monk. And Arcus. We're not really sure who Arcus is. He's this mysterious cloaked figure who enters into this kind of enemies to lovers trope with Ruby, and honestly, that's what made this book so good to me. I loved the relationship between Arcus and Ruby. I loved their banter, I loved their jokes, I loved their evolving friendship and mentorship and just kind of hate at times because they do not get along at all at first, and it's just so fun seeing this trope played out in Frostblood because I think Ellie Blake did it so well. Another thing that I loved was that it just had all the staples of kind of an adult fantasy book with good writing carrying them. We have scenes with like a lot of food and disastrous journeys into the winter woods. We have very realistic portrayals of grief and loss. And like I said, Ruby and Arcus, I just really love them so much, and I'm so thankful that I have 2 more books to get through in the series because I'm really looking forward to it. Was it a hugely substance-filled book? No. Did I care? No. So I loved it. I gave it 4 stars. We have a book that was a pretty big disappointment because I was looking forward to kind of my monthly Star Wars dose of serotonin, and this one didn't really deliver at all. That is Crash of Fate by Zoraida Cordova. This was a wholly original Star Wars story, which I love. I've said that before. I love new, fresh ideas in the landscape of Star Wars. So in this one, we are following 2 people who have known each other basically their whole lives. We have Jules, who has always lived on Batuu. He's pretty much worked there with his family, and now he is older and he works still on Batuu. And we also have Izzy, who moved with her family away from Batuu when she was very young because her family was doing some shady business. She's all grown up, her family is dead, and she's back on Batuu to carry out a secret mission. So she reconnects with Jules, and together they kind of reignite their childhood friendship, and obviously there's more there now. But number 1, I thought the writing was quite bland. There was nothing to it. I didn't feel anything for these characters. I didn't care. They were just paper thin. I felt like the plot just went around in endless circles. Overall, I just was not thrilled at all. I felt like it didn't hit any of the marks for any Star Wars kind of story I was looking for, and so I was really disappointed with this. Next, we have a book that was a really interesting concept and premise, and there was so much literary cool amazing things going on in it, and that is Little Gods. Now this was like a weird experience because I absolutely like fell in love with the huge concepts that are being played around within this book. This book deals a lot with physics and time and past and present and future, and this kind of arrow of time that we always think of when we measure time. Dealt a lot with language and family. It also dealt a lot with Chinese history, and our protagonist is this young girl whose mother takes her to America from China, and then eventually when she's older she finds out her mother has passed away. She comes back to China to find out all she can about her mother because her mother was a huge, prominent, brilliant physicist who was working on these crazy experiments to try and almost reverse our brain's concepts of time, in that entropy would run the other way and we would remember the future. Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love books that tackle and integrate and kind of tangle themselves in science, physics, weird problems like this and concepts like this. I think it is so interesting, so fascinating. I love the marriage of literature and science. One of my favorite things for sure. And to see like that concept of entropy and time and the past and the present tied with these ideas of heritage and forgetting your past or your culture or anything that you've moved away from, in this case literally, because our protagonist has moved to America and now she's coming back, and she finds out that a lot about her birth and her history and her family, she doesn't know where her father is. A lot of what's been told to her isn't true, and a lot of it has been fabricated. So there's so much about these two concepts playing themselves out both in the realms of science and in the realms of life. I felt like the writing was very detached. I didn't feel close to any of the characters, and it felt like a very how do I describe it? Almost like a very just logical putting down of the story in scientific terms. I'd recommend this book if you like seeing those topics of science and exploration and time and thermodynamics and weird stuff being played around with, because it was so interesting seeing our main character, who is the mother, I guess really, what she's doing and why she wants to do this and why she wants to carry it out and how that connects with who she is as a person, all aspects of her being. Of course, also along that line, it dealt with memory so much, which is one of my favorite topics ever. And I think that was a really strong part of this novel as well. I just didn't love the writing. I didn't love the way that these ideas were carried out when they were put onto paper, if that makes sense. But I gave it 3 stars. No, I gave it 3.5 stars. I might revisit this novel in the future because I just loved its ideas so much. Then we have a book that was honestly quite a big struggle to get through, and as I get further and further away from it, I'm finding that I'm disliking it more and more the more I kind of drive away from it, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is an absolutely massive book. If you don't know what it's about, very briefly, we're following Addie LaRue. She's living in 18th century France. She makes a deal with a devil. She becomes immortal. However, no one can remember her, no one can say her name. She can't imprint herself onto the memories or minds of anyone she meets. So we follow her over 300 years, all the way up to 2014, New York, when she meets, oh, that was my pelvis cracking, did you hear that? When she meets this young boy named Henry, who can remember her. There are a lot of pros for this book, but there's also a lot of cons. Let's start with the good stuff. I really enjoyed the concept. It's a concept that's been carried out hundreds of times, but specifically in Addie LaRue, it became so much about art and who is really responsible, who is the artist, what is being created, and how is something being made, from what material, and in this case in the archive of the human mind. So much of it is just subconscious. You don't even know that it's there, and because Addie can't be remembered, she tries her hardest to touch the lives of these artists, be it musicians, painters, sculptors, writers, and put a part of herself into their work even though they won't ever know it. And so much of this book is following those artifacts, those pieces of art that Addie has touched without the world ever knowing that she's touched them. I think that's a beautiful idea, and it applies to every single piece of art or anything we look at ever, but it's not really an idea that we too strongly consider in this world of celebrity, in this world of like one person autonomy and independence and putting one name on one thing, even though nothing ever really belongs to a single person at all. So that was a really, really beautiful idea. I loved where this book ultimately headed. I just wish it would have headed that way earlier, if that makes sense, because this is an extremely long book, you guys. It's almost 500 pages, and it felt like it. What made it feel really long and at times a chore to get through for me was V.E. Schwab's writing. I've heard lots of people absolutely adore the writing, and I think it is a very polarizing kind of writing. It is very easy for you to either completely love or to completely hate. It is not like V.E. Schwab's writing in anything I've read from her previously. The writing is just chock full, stuffed full of metaphor, simile, these repeating kind of triplety patterned sentences of either description or dialogue where she will describe the same thing with like 3 different similes or in 3 different ways, and it's always this kind of like bum 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 rhythm to the writing. And after 500 pages of the same thing, I got so sick of it. As you can imagine, a book where our protagonist is someone who can only ever be experienced in metaphor, in simile, presenting herself as something else, trying to make herself be seen as something other than she's not because she can't be seen for what she is. I imagine there is a reason why V.E. Schwab chose to write this book with so many similes, but it actually got like ridiculous, and I don't think it was a good way to go about it because I got so just like nauseous of the same writing presenting itself over and over again. It felt really dramatic, it felt really cliche. It just didn't work for me at all, as much as I appreciate the fact that the writing is mirroring the plot and Addie's emotions, because she just feels like she's experiencing the same thing over and over again. Of course, her life is very repetitive, human history is very repetitive, and she's getting so fed up with her world of just being the same thing over and over again, and she can't ever change. So I did appreciate that. I just don't think it was a good tactic to use for an almost 500-page book where so much of the writing is just this one formula for a sentence or a paragraph, and then V.E. Schwab just seems to swap out the variables, plop new words in, and she's good to go. I don't know how she didn't get so exhausted writing this book, because I could not have done that. It felt so trapped, so suffocated. And once again, that is how Addie feels throughout the book, so that's quite cool. I just don't think it made it an enjoyable, readable experience, if that makes sense. I also think there were thousands of missed opportunities throughout this book because we jump back and forth between 2 timelines. We have 2014 New York, which I just vehemently disliked this whole timeline. I thought it was awfully boring, so repetitive in an already repetitive book. And then we jump back to Addie's voyage through human history, and that is where most of those missed opportunities I feel were. She had so much to work with, and yet she spent so much of her time in like cafes in New York, and we'll only have like 2-page scenes where Addie's like a spy in a world war, or she's witnessing the French Revolution. I gave it 3.75 stars, but now that I'm thinking of it, I'm thinking like maybe 3.5. I did enjoy the ending of this book, but I do think this book took around 400 pages before it got anywhere near good for me, so that was really a chore you had to work at. It was hard to love this book, to try and love this book. So those are my thoughts on The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Next up, I read a collection of kind of poetry, prose. It is technically, I think, listed as an essay, and that is Bluets by Maggie Nelson. I ended up giving this 3.75 again. A lot of this honestly just didn't click with me, like Maggie Nelson's writing in this little creation just didn't really do anything for me. It was kind of a case again where I love the ideas that were played around within here, because Bluets is a book about blue, the color blue, but it is so much more than that. It's also about our speaker in these passages. There are numbered passages, really struggling with grief and with the loss of this relationship that is now ended. It's also about her pain while she's seeing her friend who has recently been paralyzed go through this horrific time in her life and this horrific trauma that has happened to her. So there's a lot more than just blue in here. We have these different lenses and these different shades and these different colors of blue being played around with. The nature of blue, she goes on scientific explorations. She explains blue in a number of different ways. She looks at a number of different texts and authors and historians and scientists and what everyone has to say about blue, but it's also the speaker struggling through these kind of waves of blue to get to what she really means and the suffering and the hurt that she's really feeling. I loved that idea, and I think this is a really brilliant little book, but it just really didn't click personally for me. I think so many people could love this book, and I can like see that, and it's almost there for me, but it just didn't happen. All right, let's learn a new word because we finally have a book where I learned a new word. We actually have a couple in this one. I think I'm just gonna say both because both of them are incredibly cool. The first one is koan. I hope I'm saying that right. It's just K-O-A-N. But a koan is a paradox to be meditated on, and it is used to train Zen Buddhist monks to abandon their dependence on reason and to gain sudden intuitive enlightenment, which I think is so cool. It just comes from the Japanese word of the same spelling, of the same everything, koan. The second word is also extremely cool, and that is samsara. That is repeated cycles of birth, misery, and death caused by karma. And this comes from the Sanskrit samsara, which literally means passing through. Next, we read a classic that I love so much, definitely one of my favorite reads of this month as well, and that is A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I love this. I'd kind of forgotten that I had ever experienced or read A Little Princess until I started reading it and remembered that in 4th grade my teacher read it to us and we got to watch the movie, and it was just such a wonderful, beautiful experience. Reading it again for myself this time with an audiobook was no different. If you've never heard of A Little Princess, we're following Sarah Crewe. Her father drops her off in London at a seminary because he has to go back to India to work. Sarah is extremely rich. She has everything she ever wants. She is the poster pupil for Miss Minchin's seminary. But all of this changes when Sarah's father dies in India, loses his fortune, and leaves his daughter penniless. School won't kick her out onto the street, and so she is relegated to a maid, a servant for the school. She has to do everything that everyone tells her, and her life is miserable. She is always cold and hungry and suffering and harassed, and it is so awful to see her go through this because she's really a good person. So much of this book is about the power of imagination and stories because Sarah is like the world's best storyteller, the world's best imaginative mind, and she always revives and calls up and creates these scenarios and these fantasy worlds and these situations where entering into them in just the landscape of her mind, little like mind palace, really makes the painful reality of her situation not so painful and not so bad. It's just really, really witnessing the unlimited power of her mind and of her mindset and of her unrelenting hope. I think it was beautifully written. It was an extremely cozy, comfy, calming book. I really wanted to stay in its pages forever. I loved it so much. The word I learned is punctilious, which means marked by or concerned about precise accordance with details of codes and conventions. So that is A Little Princess. Next up, we have my 5-star read, another one of this month, and this was the Dark Academics book for November, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. Lugubrious. Lugubrious, meaning mournful or dismal, from the Latin lugubris, from the verb lugere, which means to mourn, coming from the Greek ligros, which means mournful. I absolutely adored this book. Another spooky book that I got to read in November. This is a Victorian Gothic ghost story where we follow an unnamed governess as she voyages to Bly Manor to look after 2 perfect, angelic, beautiful children, Miles and Flora. It's all going great until she starts seeing ghosts. Henry James, his writing was very difficult to get into at first and to really see exactly what the governess and what anyone is saying in this book, because no one ever says anything they mean at all in this book, and you have to really like search and dig up the earth to find what anyone is trying to say. This is an extremely taut, tense, suspenseful, crazy little book where like you go insane trying to read it. I love the imagery, I love the atmosphere, I love how you can literally spend the rest of your life like analyzing this book through every lens ever, and all of them would be applicable and all of them would come up with very abundant findings. Yeah, I just love the unknowable in here. I loved all the themes that were explored. I ended up loving his writing and I was so impressed. I gave it 5 stars. I'm definitely gonna read it again and again and again. I read another spooky book, House of Salt and Sorrows by Aaron A. Craig. This is a retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses. I had extremely high hopes for this book, and for the first 50% of this book, they were all met. I was loving the spooky, gothic, ocean atmosphere Ocean Gothic is just like such a superb genre that I never even knew that I wanted in my life until Aaron A. Craig gave me a dose of it, only to rip it all away from me. In House of Salt and Sorrows, we're following our protagonist. Oh my gosh, what's her name? I don't remember her. Annalee. There we go. They're all kind of named after people and women from Edgar Allan Poe's tales. So her name is Annalee. She is one of the sisters. However, many of her sisters have been dying due to really horrific, awful, random things like the plague. Her sister Eulalie, who just died, was she pushed? I don't know. She fell off a cliff. I misspoke. Her other sister drowned in the bathtub. There's just so much horrifying, gory, awful things going on to this family. We're set in this wonderful, waterlogged ocean, tumultuous, wavy kingdom where they live at Highmore, which is this palace on the rocks overlooking the wavy, rocky ocean, and I absolutely loved the setting. I didn't know that this like fear of sea creatures and weird octopi and caverns and caves and grottos combined with these gothic elements of architecture and mystery and spookiness and Victorian era shenanigans was amazing. It worked so well. I loved it. I loved those themes, and I honestly would have been so happy. I would have given this book 4 stars if Aaron A. Craig had just stayed in that place at Highmore, and she literally could have just described Annalee's like daily routine, her going to like the fish market, her going out on the water, her going to the lighthouse, what she did with her sisters. She could have just stayed in that atmosphere with literally nothing happening except for this experience of environment, and I would have given it 4 stars. That's how much I really, really loved this combination. But then we reached the middle of the book and it just went completely off the rails. Everything you thought this book was going to be about was just ripped away, and these really, really silly, weird, random, just strange things started to happen. I don't think it was done well. It kind of tried to be a little bit like that element in Turn of the Screw, where it's so ambiguous, you don't know what's going on, you can't tell what reality is, but it just didn't work in House of Salt and Sorrows at all. I don't think it was skillfully done. I think it was really sloppily, really just shoved in there, and it wasn't working. Very sad about that one, but I now know that I'm just gonna call it Ocean Gothic, and I would love to look for more of that in my life. So if you know of any, please, please tell me. Another extremely spooky book, we have The House in the Dark of the Woods by Laird Hunt. This book was just like, what is going on? How do I even begin to explain this? How do I want to start this? I kind of know. We're set in America in Puritan times. We have this Puritan village with this young woman who goes out into the woods. She is only ever called Goody, only ever answers to Goody, and she starts to meet these other women in the woods. Initially, she goes into the woods to pick berries for her husband and her son, we think. She goes into the woods and she starts to meet these strange people. She meets a woman called Captain Jane, who essentially leads people through the woods, kind of telling them where to go, helping them find their way. She meets this woman named Eliza, who has a house in the dark of the woods where Goody stays for a number of days and nights. The way it leads you along, it's very extremely fairy tale-esque, creepy, like original fairy tale, dark, very extremely dark, creepy, disturbing. Things are just weird at first in the house in the dark of the woods, and then they start to get extremely unsettling. You get the sense that something is extremely wrong, but you can't really put your finger on it, which makes it worse. Laird Hunt's writing was extremely beautiful, and at times I just could not make sense of what was happening in this book at all. There's so many strange, weird scenes. There's so many wonderful kind of nursery rhyme, scary writing things going on in this book as well, which is super interesting. There's really beautiful passages in this book, which I adored, and it makes the mystery and kind of the very, like, what's going on, like, don't look over your shoulder kind of feeling more. Things aren't really making any sense for a very long time in this book. Things seem to just be happening randomly or going in circles as we follow Goody as she's staying at Eliza's house, as she's wandering through the woods. It's such an ambiguous, weird little tale where you're like, is she kidnapped? Is she trying to find someone? Is she playing hide and seek in the woods? Is she crazy? Is she a criminal? You just don't know. And then near the end of the book, so much is revealed to you, and you're just kind of like, what? I was a little bit disappointed because when I went into this book, found out we're dealing with this Puritan village and these women in the woods, immediately there's so much about witchcraft going on, and I wanted this book to go a very specific way. However, Laird Hunt takes it the extreme opposite way because it does follow the style, like I said, of an extremely dark original fairy tale, and then the ending happens. And for me, I loved the ending on one part, but I really, really disliked it on the other because it felt extremely pointless. This is a book I definitely want to read again because it's one of those books where you get to the ending and then you're like, oh man, I missed all of that and now I need to go back and look at it again. I think I gave it 3.5 stars, but I think if I read it for myself and like really got to pull out those terrifying bits and parts, because this is a really scary book, I would really appreciate it more. So that's The House in the Dark of the Woods. Finally read BookTube's Baby. This is always the book that I associate with BookTube. Before I started BookTube or anything like that, it was always the book that I was like, yes, that is the ultimate book that everyone has read, and I haven't read it, and that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was my first Taylor Jenkins Reid book at all. I didn't really know what to expect. I had no idea what this book was about somehow. I loved it. I loved it. I think it is worth the hype for sure. But if you don't know what The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is about, Evelyn Hugo is a movie star. She is now extremely elderly, and she has just asked a reporter to write her memoir, to write her biography, and she's going to tell the truth of what happened during her years as a movie star, why she married so many times, what went down behind the scenes, and the real scoop. This was an extremely entertaining book. Taylor Jenkins Reid has that like just immediately gripping sensationalist writing that makes you not want to look away. It makes you feel like you are being promised a story and you are being promised these like details and this narrative that you don't want to ever step away from. And I like listened to this book over a period of like 2 listening sessions because it became super addictive. I just wanted to know what happened, and that is like a really big skill in her writing. It felt extremely real when I finished this book. I like told a whole bunch of people that it felt like I had just stepped out of a movie theater and I didn't know what to do with my life anymore. It's that feeling when you step out into the cold open air after being so immersed in something on screen in a different world in someone else's life, and you're like, well, what now? So I was just extremely impressed. I almost cried at this book, which never happens. Was not expecting that, but like it almost happened. It just really made a place in my heart, and I loved it so much. I would highly recommend. I just think it's one of those books you got to read, so I don't want to say any more about it now, but now I understand. I know. I have read it. Very happy about that. The word I learned is glib. Now this is a word I have always seen, and I've kind of like glossed the meaning of it, but I'm like, if someone really asked me to sit down and tell you what glib meant, I could not. And it means showing little forethought or preparation. It can also mean nonchalant or superficial. This one has a really fun etymology because it comes from the Low German glibberig, which means slippery. All right, second last book I read in November was Oscar Wilde's famous play, Salome. I love this, of course I did. I don't really have that much to say about it. It has Oscar Wilde's beautiful writing, so much imagery. You can like really see specifically what he's saying in these passages and in these scenes. It is a one-act tragedy following Salome, who is King Herod's daughter. It was eventually banned for obscenity when it first came out, and it is a really intense play. There's a lot going on in a very short space of time. Like I said, it's literally 40 pages. But his writing just like grabs on to things and makes you see them in a really beautiful, descriptive way. The thing I loved most in this play probably is just there's this whole theme of looking and the gaze and what people's vision does to things, how it transfigures things, how it changes things, and what different gazes do to different things. In the case of Salome, everyone looks at her, and there's so much being said that like, don't look at her, something awful will happen if you look at her, and what her gaze does to those that she looks upon. It just follows this one night at King Herod's, I guess, feasting hall, and what goes down with King Herod, his wife, and his daughter in his stepdaughter Salome. And finally, the last book that I read was the really fun, cute, wonderful middle grade The Mysterious Howling by Mary Rose Wood. This was really fun. We're following a 15-year-old governess named Penelope, and she arrives at this manor. I think the year is 1851, although it never explicitly says that, but like that's what I used my knowledge of history. It's 1851. And she is having to take care of these 3 children. When she gets to this manor, she hears this howling, this awful howling, kind of like this baying of hounds. She presumes it's coming from like a wolf or like a stable dog or something like that, but it turns out to be the 3 children. So what happened is that these 3 children were found in the woods. They were literally raised by wolves. They don't speak English. They don't have any manners. They don't know what it's like to be human children. And so you follow Penelope trying to introduce them into Victorian society. I loved it so much. It was so cute. It was extremely cozy. It was also centered around Christmas, which worked out perfectly because it was the last book I read in November, and it was just a really nice segue. But I really loved these children. They were just, you really felt for them, and you felt for their relationship with Penelope, and you just really rooted for them against this harsh, strict backdrop where no leniency and no going outside of anyone's boxes or parameters is really allowed in this society or in this household. Definitely very interested in continuing this series along. The first one was an extremely short book, so I gave it a very loving 3 stars, and that is The Mysterious Howling. I think, yeah, the series is called The Incorrigible Children of Ashton Place, if you're interested. So, all right, I think we finally made it again through the long month of November and everything I read. Let me know what your favorite book of the month was too, because I always add them to my list as well. And I'll see you very soon in my next video. Ciao.